Judy and I came here about 36 years ago, and we bought this place here. It was an existing orchard, and it did sell a little bit of fruit roadside in some boxes, and people just left the money there and that type of thing. A lot of the orchards are quite old, and a lot of very old varieties that weren't bringing a lot of money. So we started a whole thing of regeneration of the orchards and pulling out old varieties, trying to get the soil back into good condition. The pH was very, very low, and organic matter was very, very low. So we tried to build that up and plant new varieties that were more brought more money in than the older varieties. So that was our main focus when we came. We came to try and develop this as an orchard and as a modern orchard. In those days, modern was planting at probably 5 metres by 2.5 metres, and we did do some of that for sure. But after a while, we decided, after some trips overseas, that we should be planting a lot more dense plantings, more trees per hectare. And so we brought that into 4 metres and 1.75 metres between the trees. So that made it a lot more dense. Our production per hectare went up, and so that was very good. We came in '86, so we didn't know much about M9 rootstock until the late '80s, when I travelled overseas to America and to Europe. But in 1976. Before we even bought this place, we went to Kent in England and saw some M9 rootstock trees growing there, and pretty close planting. And that all stuck in the back of my mind, and it made so I knew where I was going. I just had to work out how to get there, type of thing. We didn't have M9 rootstock until Van Zeller's, Adrian and Tony Van Zeller and Jen got some M9 from Orange and started working with that, and they grew some rootstock then, and so we got some rootstock out of that and planted our first M9 trees. Over the years, we've developed nearly all our orchard on M9 or M26, and at this point in time, virtually all our orchard is on M9 and M26, and so our production has come, as far as the orchard has come down to a lot closer plantings, now about 3.5 by 1 metre, and that again has lifted our production. So we expect to get between 60 and 80 tonnes, up to 100 tonnes per hectare, which we've got on some blocks. And in that time, we started to do a little bit more with the stall, trying to put a few things more down there, a bit of jam and that type of thing. And over the years, we built that up, and it became part of our business, and now it's a major part of our business. And about 8 years ago, we decided, or 10 years ago, we decided we really had to do some value adding because we weren't making enough out of some of our fruit, and that's when we started making apple cider vinegar, and so we went into that, and that went well. We were selling it at the stall, and it was going well, and so we thought, well, if we're making apple cider vinegar, why not make apple cider? And so we started in this block here, actually, with planting, grafting over Sundowner, which was an older variety which we weren't making much money out of, into cider apples. And we were fortunate enough to know or to meet some people in the industry where we got wood from. Drew Henry was certainly we went down there and spent, Judy and I and Rachel spent a day down there and with him, and that was brilliant, and it really got us going. And we got a lot of wood from him, and we asked about wood, and he said, well, look, he said, I've pruned these trees and those trees sort of things, but he said, if you want to go and prune some more, you just go ahead and prune it and take whatever you want. Yeah. And so we did, and we got these 4 varieties from him there. But he was certainly a very good mentor. But people like David Pickering was good. But I think the real impetus was when Batlow started having a cider fest and then the cider conference. And so we got all those, knowledgeable people to the area and spoke And to me, that's where I really learnt. In the past, I'd travel to Somerset particularly, but that area around there, and to France, to Normandy, where they grow cider, and looked at cider in those areas. Spoke to people. I know quite a few of the growers in England, and they again have been really, really good for getting me up and running on cider. But in lots of cases, it was sort of little bits of information and moving on all the time. It wasn't. We didn't go into growing cider and making cider, knowing it all, knowing enough about it. And so our early attempts weren't all that flash, but we've grown into that by a lot of help from other people. We started out, like I said, getting from Drew Henry these varieties. The varieties we got were Kingston Black, Dabinet, Michelin, and Bulmer's Norman, and that's these ones that are behind me here, some of these trees here. This was a block of Sundowner. We grafted it over. They were on M9, and we were told by most people that wasn't the way to grow cider apples. You needed to have on big rootstock. We couldn't buy an apple tree grafted on M9. No one did it. It was either on 102 or 111 or 106, and so we did. Most of our trees are grafted trees, so we grafted over orchard that wasn't bringing us enough money, and we saw a future in cider. So those 4 varieties were our first varieties, and then we went on with things like Brown Snout, with Yarlington Mill, with Brown's Apple, with Somerset Red Streak, with Sweet Alfred, with Faucon Rouge, and Red Stoke lately. So there's some of the varieties that we've got now. Oh, I think it's a brilliant system. I think if you're growing one tree up there, it's obviously going to fill that space, sort of thing. So you've got bigger limbs and all those sort of things. Here, with a twin leader system, we've got smaller branches, easier to control the apple, the tree, and the production, I think, is it increases production off that area because you haven't got that centre area of a traditional tree that is shaded, so you've got all your fruit basically out in the sun. So far, we've had very little biennial bearing, and we haven't had it on things like Michelin. It's about every year it's produced. Bulmer's Norman's produced every year. Kingston Black's produced every year. Dabinet's produced every year. The only one we've had a little bit of biennial bearing in is Brown Snout. But what we tend to get is a lighter crop every year type of thing. Some years a little bit more, but we can't get that full crop so far. I mean, I'll get that full crop on Brown Snout. But all the other varieties that we've planted, we're getting pretty consistent cropping. This year is probably pretty heavy. So next year I would assume that it might be a little bit lighter, but I would assume we'd still have a good crop. And the reason and how we're doing that is basically by opening the tree up, like you were saying, getting more light into the tree, so the buds are better organised. We don't do a lot of fertilising, and certainly with cider apples, we don't want a big puffy apple with that hasn't a lot of flavour. So you'll notice that most of the apples are smaller apples, which is typical of cider apples. But also, if you do get biennial bearing, you tend to get big apples one year and very small apples the next year. But we've had this size apple nearly all the way through now. They do respond quite differently, and that's interesting. But because they're all on the same rootstock, I can compare one to the other. And certainly things like Kingston Black grow very well here. The tree grows very well. Production is good. It doesn't normally tend to overcrop that much, but this year it has, and we've done some thinning on that. We've done some hand thinning on most of our varieties this year. Dabinet is a consistent cropper, and it's not a big cropper, but it's a consistent cropper. When you've got something like Michelin or Bulmer's Norman, they're prolific croppers. They just every bit of the tree has got apples on it, and you have to come in and hand thin there to get a little bit of size. We don't want a big cider apple, and what I've seen overseas and in other areas, you don't get a great big cider apple. You can get some varieties that are bigger, especially some of the crab varieties. But things like Yarlington Mill set a very good crop every year, and they're easy to control. They're reasonably vigorous. Our red stoke, which we've only just had for 3 years now, are very, very vigorous on M9. They grow well, and after a couple of years or 3 years, they start to set quite a good crop. Things like Brown's apple is a very good cropper. It's a bushier tree. It's not as like Dabinet is a more open tree. Brown's apple is a bushier tree, and you've got to be careful to allow more light into it. A little bit more pruning involved in Brown's apple. But things like Frucan Rouge just seems to crop and crop and crop. Somerset Red Streak is not quite as good a cropper, but it's still quite good, and you can get bigger fruit on Somerset Red Streak. But so that's generally how we've seen them. But because they're all on the same rootstock, it makes it much easier. I think that the main thing is that we hand thin, particularly to make sure the tree's still growing. We don't want to stunt the tree by having a lot of fruit on it. I think if we hadn't hand thinned, all the way along, sort of thing, what we'd end up with is more biennial bearing, but also a more stunted tree. And from my understanding, when a tree is in a growth stage, it's not going to produce much fruit. When it's in a reproductive phase, that is when it's producing fruit, then it's not going to grow so much. So we're looking to try and keep it in that reproductive stage as much as we can, so that the tree gives us a crop every year. Yield has been very, very good from the sort of yields that I see other people talk about. It's yields very, very good, especially this year, but we have had a lot of rain this year, and so we do hand thinning, and you'll see this variety here, Dabinet. It's a good crop. We could have done a little bit more hand thinning, but we just decided that we'd leave them as they are, because it tends to crop every year, even though it's got a heavy crop. The other thing that we worry about is if it's overcropped, especially when we've got a narrow tree that is quite reasonably tall, without any big branches in the top of the tree, the top can break out. And so we want to try and get, especially off the top, we take some fruit off. We haven't on these here, but we've got another row of Dabinet which were younger, 2 years younger, and so we basically took most of the fruit off the top of the tree to try and make it continue to grow up. We're not on flat land, we're on side slope and all sorts of things like that. So I think that hand thinning is very good for quality and for the tree. I think that by hand picking, we get the best apples. We're able to sort any poor apples or damaged apples in the orchard, so we don't have to spend a lot of money in the shed sorting fruit, which I see a lot of sheds have a lot of people sorting the fruit. So I think those two things are the main sort of things that I think why we do it. But the third thing is getting a premium product, or a product that you can put a premium on. And we're in a situation where we can do that because we're selling direct to the public. And I think selling direct to the public is really good because you get instant feedback from people. You get people who are interested in your story, how we grow, all those sort of things. And so then you can add that little bit of information to the price. So we were trying to sell into Canberra, but the costs of getting it over there, storing it over there somewhere, and somebody to distribute it and somebody to take money out of it, just wasn't, we couldn't then justify the extra effort we'd put in here. But by selling it direct and selling it with a story with it, I think that's, I think we've shown that we can justify that.
My name's Rachel Galvin. I've worked at Wilgro for about 17 years, 18 seasons. I'm the orchard manager. We've actually found it quite easy. We've just naturally rolled with it there, and we treat them just like we do a dessert apple. The trees beside us here, they're yielding quite well, and by not having biennial bearing trees, you can justify costs as well there, and having them cropped up like we do there, consistently year in, year out, it makes the world of difference cost effectively wise to treat them just like a dessert apple. Cider apples aren't a big apple, so it takes usually twice as long to pick a bin of cider apples than it does a normal dessert eating apple. But generally speaking, for us, the way our central leaded trees and the way we've got them set up there, we can't justify buying a mechanical harvester, and being an M9 rootstock and the way they're trained, we couldn't do it. So yeah, we believe here we can justify costs of manually picking it, just like we do dessert apples, because we do everything here on farm. Everything's done on farm, therefore we don't have an outlay to anyone else, and we get everything back rather than paying someone to do it. The cider varieties clump, so that means you sort of have to grab the whole group as you pick, or else you seem to drop a lot. But generally speaking, it's quite easy, and bruising isn't an issue. Because you don't have to be so gentle, and we haven't found here at Wilgro that a bruised piece of fruit tastes any different when juicing. Here at Wilgro, we actually like the Kingston Black. Being the king of cider apples, we find it makes one of the best ciders. Along with Brown Snout. Brown Snout makes an awesome varietal cider, but we're finding each cider variety that we do have has its own distinct characters.
My vision is a very optimistic vision, but it's something that can happen. And what I'd like to see is Batlow developed. It's a small area, Batlow. It's not a big production area, and it shouldn't be a big production area for cider. It can be big, but it's not. The amount of land in Batlow is not like, say, Shepparton or somewhere like that, where it's a different scenario altogether. We've got great soils here, we've got great rainfall here, we've got cold, which is really good for cider apples. I think we've got everything that should be a great cider area, and I would love to see that. But my vision would be more for smaller producers, boutique type producers, selling direct, so people come to the area and this becomes a destination. If you go to places like the Hunter Valley or Coonawarra or this sort of thing, people go there as a destination and they try the different wines. That's what should happen in Batlow. It's always worth coming to Batlow. I think it's a great place. But certainly with the conference here, the growers that are here and the people who are doing cider, I think it's a great opportunity to look at a different area and to come to Batlow, because that's where you'll learn about cider and cider making. I think, in my experience, the conferences have been a tremendous help to me to develop where we are, and I'd love to stay on and do a lot more, and I think it would be great to have that conference. I mean, it was great when it was here in Batlow each year. I see the logic of having it in other places, but coming back to Batlow this year, I think everybody should come to Batlow.